Good afternoon and welcome to the debut spotlight. My name is Ellen Comisar and I'm delighted to have with me the author, Cory Leadbeater, whose newest book, his first book, is The Uptown Local, Joy, Death, and Joan Didion. And I can tell you when I read this way back when, and went on my own little social media campaign with his publicist and his publisher to make sure that I could book Cory. And you'll see why if his book is out this week. So most of you haven't read it yet, but I think you'll all want to read it once you hear our discussion. For those of you who are returning to the Blaze, thank you so much for your viewership and support. For those of you who are new to the Blaze, welcome. Let me just tell you that we are a group of 30 or so creative volunteers who are determined to bring literature into your living room. This started at the beginning of COVID with Jenna Blum and Caroline Levitt, who realized that authors were having their tours, just halted and stopped for some indefinite amount of time. So they started this with this idea, and it has been going strong since and is going to continue well beyond our difficult COVID days. You can find out a lot about us at our website, amightyblaze.com, and can sign up for our newsletter there, which you would get once a week in your email box and find out all about our shows and other programming. We are also all over social media, so please like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, go to our YouTube channel and subscribe. We're on Instagram, and we love hearing from our readers, so please follow us, converse with us, ask us your questions, and we will certainly be responsive. And one of the ways we're responsive is in bringing you great authors like Cory. So Cory's debut has been called A Glorious Written Recollection That Does Right by Joan Didion by Publishers Weekly, which gave it a starred review. And Sam Lipsyte, the novelist and short story writer, said that in his book, we also discover a young man from a tough town whose life was saved by literature, by art, by music, and by the mentorship of those who had come this way before him. And we'll talk about a little bit of that. And the last piece of praise, and there were many to choose from, is from Lily Danziger, whose book of essays, First Love, is actually absolutely beautiful. I just read that. And she says, the Uptown Local renders the dizzying, sometimes painful experience of becoming yourself in prose that perfectly mirrors the story at its heart, at once tender and brutal, surreal and direct, cerebral and visceral. Here, the contradictions of a bifurcated life are not smoothed over, but pulled apart and examined with curiosity, rigor, and love. So that's some fine praise for our new friend, Cory Leadbeater. And I'll give you, if you don't mind, I'll read your official bio, and then we can launch right into it. So Cory Leadbeater received his MFA in fiction from Columbia in 2014, where he was the recipient of the Jacob P. Waletsky Fellowship. Before that, he attended Trinity College, where he was the recipient of the Fred File Memorial Prize in Creative Writing, the John Curtis Underwood Memorial Prize in Poetry, and the Ruel Crompton Tuttle Prize in Scholarship. He lives in New Jersey with his family. So welcome.
And Ellen, thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us today. So give us, for those of people who haven't read and are now curious about the subtitle, Joy, Death, and Joan Didion, give us a little overview of how this book came to be and what your relationship with Joan was.
Yeah, so the short version is that I went to Columbia for grad school and sought out a particular professor there who mentored me and had a relationship with Joan. And when Joan's need for a personal assistant sort of became apparent, this professor put me up for the job, and I had no idea what I was getting into. It was sort of done anonymously. I was told that there was a famous writer who needed help with things, and it would his words were, it would require tact, it would be difficult, but he wouldn't tell me the writer's name. And at some point that evening, I was out, smoking cigarettes and having some drinks with friends, and the email came through. It was going to be Joan Didion, and God, every young writer dreams of that moment. And the job was supposed to last for 6 months, and it ended up lasting 9 years. And she invited me to live with her. She took me to all of these extraordinary places and events in New York and elsewhere, and opened up so many doors to me, and also was just such a loving and gracious sort of maternal presence in my life at this time when things were really tumultuous at home, and my family life was sort of degrading and decaying and really collapsing into chaos. And Joan
Mhm.
was this anchor for me. And
Made you
when
breakfast
she
every morning.
That's right, she did. I didn't know you could make a one egg omelet, but
I
there it
didn't
was.
either.
In a cast iron pan that was probably 100 years old, and it never, but when she died, I didn't know what to do. I hope what's clear in the book is how desperately I needed her in that time, and I still need her. And when she died, I was stricken with this idea that I had all of these memories that only she and I would have shared,
Mhm.
and now I was the only one with them. And so I just started putting them down, and uh, the book wrote itself basically very quickly. It was 9 to 10 years of memories that had just been condensing and condensing inside of me that whole time. And then suddenly, in 3 months, the book was done.
Wow.
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw, but Brendan Leadbeater is on is watching and put up a post saying, "Love you, brother." So
That's my older brother. Yeah.
that's nice. Always good to have family support. Um,
Absolutely.
so you didn't know from the start that you were going to write this book, or did you have an
Absolutely
inkling?
not. No, no. In fact, I fought the urge forever. Everyone who met me at that time, who discovered, I kept my relationship with Joan as under wraps as I could. But when I would reveal this information about this extraordinary, surreal situation I was in, people would say, "Well, you have to write about, what the hell are you doing writing about Oklahoma, or fracking, or wheat fields? Like, this is the story here." And I think part of it was that I couldn't admit to myself that the story would have an ending. I also think I needed to wait to see how it would conclude to sort of start understanding the shape of what had happened. Um, but yeah, I really fought against it for a really long time. And then after I wrote the book, I started remembering all of these conversations I would have in workshop or in bars with friends, and they would say, why Oklahoma? What about what's happening here? And I would say, oh God, in fact, I put this line in the memoir. I used to tell people the way that you do when you're a 24-year-old grad student and you feel certain about these things. I used to say, writing based on your life is so lazy. I want to feel imaginative, and I want to feel free, and I don't want to base anything on anyone I know. And God, what an idiot.
Well, at the time, you
But
had
yeah,
no idea you'd meet Joan. I mean, it's not
yeah,
like, average writer telling you about their childhood friend.
yeah.
It's a little different. Um, were you taking notes along the way or keeping a diary of sorts, or was this just all internal?
It was all internal. I always say to people, I don't think I how do I phrase this? The only things that might be somewhat unique to me as a writer is that I have an extraordinary memory and a really hardworking person. And I'm just fortunate that all of those memories really lodged themselves in and
Mm-hmm.
stayed. I don't want to say they stayed perfectly intact, but they remained more or less available to me. So when I started revisiting them, they were still very clear. And I think just the extraordinary nature of what I was experiencing made those things burrow into my brain so deeply. I mean, um, if you grew up in this area, driving down Fifth Avenue or walking down Fifth Avenue past the Met, and just seeing scores of tourists and school trips and all of these people on the steps and thinking, God, what's it like to just be there alone? And then to just walk in there at 8 o'clock in the morning with Joan Didion and look at, a Turner painting or something. You'd be hard pressed to not remember every detail of that kind of experience.
That
So,
was pretty cool.
uh, yeah, I'll say.
The power, they won't let you do that this next week or anything, will they?
No, I don't. I haven't tested. I haven't tested that level of membership yet.
um, so I do want to ask you a few things. You talk about, memories, things that came up after you submitted the book. What is your favorite Joan memory that you put in the book, and what is one of the favorite ones or prominent ones that have come to your mind since this book was submitted and accepted?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of my favorite memories I guess two that I put in the book. The first time that I met her, I almost cut my hand very badly. I was so overwhelmed. I was so nervy, and I had read about that apartment so much in the Year of Magical Thinking and Blue Nights. And so stepping into it as a real human being was like walking onto a movie set or something like that. And there she was, just standing there talking to me, and we were having sandwiches. And she passed me a knife to cut my sandwich, and it wasn't going through. So I sort of put my hand down on top of the knife to push harder, and I was holding the knife backwards. I mean, this is not my first time using a knife, but it's the first time using it in front of her.
Right.
And I was so embarrassed, and I looked quickly at her, see, like, did she? I've been here for 2 hours and I'm already blowing it. I can't even use a knife correctly, and I'm certain that she noticed. Probably there's nothing that ever happened in front of her that she didn't know, but she declined. I think the phrase I use in the memoir is she declined to embarrass me, which was very much the nature of our dynamic. There were a lot of times that she could have probably pointed out the silliness and ineptitude of a 24-year-old graduate student who was stepping into this life that, he had no business being in. But she was just so gracious with that, and that meant so much to me. And then another small moment in the book is we're sitting together listening to music, and God, I was wearing a hat, and without saying anything, she just reached up and took the hat off my head and put it on hers, and she wore it the rest of the day. It was such a sweet, intimate, funny thing to do, and not something you imagine her doing, I guess.
No.
But she was like that. She was like that in person. That's really difficult to convey to people who sort of only have fixed ideas about what kind of person she is. And then one more thing that didn't make it in the book. I think just the quiet days that we had, when you're with someone every single day for 9 years, there's a lot of just quiet, intimate moments, watching TV together or listening to music together or something like that. And some of my fondest memories are just sitting on the couch with her, looking out her windows at at Madison Avenue and the sky over Central Park, and just talking about what we saw or what we were feeling, or not talking at all. I wish everyone deserves the experience of just sitting in silence with someone who cares about you, and you don't have to say anything to impress them, and that deep level of intimacy and love really difficult to convey. And that's the first thing I think about whenever I think about my time with her.
Well, it seemed, I mean, I think the humor and sort of how she was in the privacy of her home was something that is, for me as a reader who has read Joan Didion and probably read a zillion articles about her, um, that was new and fresh. And so that was very rewarding to me. I also wonder, like you talk about, going out and both going out by yourself and walking around on the Upper East Side as the kid from Jersey City or the young man from Jersey City, but also then the experience of sitting on a bench outside with Joan and how people encountered you there. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, what to say? She, everyone, folks who had lived on the Upper East Side for some time, folks who are artistically aware, literarily aware, people who had some small degree of cultural sophistication, who maybe weren't bookworms but were aware of what Joan Didion represented. I mean, how you couldn't miss her, ironically, because she was the smallest, slightest person up till the end, but her iconic black sunglasses and that white bob, she was instantly recognizable. So yeah, there were plenty of people who saw her. There were plenty of people who saw her and gave her the cool New York City. We're gonna let this person be.
I did that.
You should tell your story. Yeah.
I was telling Cory before we started, I lived in New York for about a dozen years and had a friend on the Upper East Side, and I lived on the West Side. And so we would often meet in the park and go for walks. And she was in publishing and I was into literature. And we saw Joan walking and we sort of whispered to each other, "Is that Joan? Is that Joan?" And we wanted to be cool New Yorkers. So we agreed it was Joan because you can't miss her. And she's such a New York icon. She might be the literary world icon, but she really is the quintessential New York icon, way up there with the big folks, if not at the very top of that list. And so we just sort of very coolly said, "Hi, Joan," and kept walking without missing a pace, because we knew better than to stop. Because if you're a cool New Yorker, you just let her do her thing. And
yeah,
I'm sure
right.
if you were sitting on a bench with her on the Upper East Side, smoking your cigarettes, that it was a very different experience than I had.
Yeah, I mean, listen, Joan loved babies and dogs. That was her thrill. That's what we were there for her to see. And when people, young people especially, when they would come up to her and tell her how much her work meant to them, that's a great deal to her. I mean, she was not immune to that or not wanting that validation. I think it meant a lot to her. On the other hand, it was where she lived. It was her home. And so I think she had become accustomed to navigating that sort of interplay, but it was certainly new for me to experience, and really strange and wonderful and disorienting to be the person who was sitting next to her. And so sort of inculcated into this strange interaction while sort of I was obviously a support person and her assistant, but still to witness the incredible love and respect and what's the word, reverence that people had toward her. It was so cool. And then there were just the neighborhood folks who, the doormen and the chefs at the restaurants where she had house accounts, and those people who, of course, knew exactly who she was, but they called her Mrs. Dunn, and they delivered her groceries. These sort of people who fit into this strange caste system that exists on the Upper East Side in a way that it's so particular neighborhood. And if you had asked me about that the day before I started working for her, I would have said, "What on earth are you talking about?" Right. It's really something you have to see up close, firsthand, day after day, to sort of wrap your mind around it.
So one of the fascinating things about your book, and you made a perfect segue into it, is this idea of merging two lives. First of all, your life and Joan's coming together into this, you know, closed environment, mostly of her apartment and the Upper East Side, but also this idea of changing social strata, of striving, and you know, in terms of your family, of sort of chasing the American dream, which, you know, is certainly something that she was writing about at various points and examining America. Um, how did that idea of the American dream affect you as you were going through this, or become realized through your relationship with Joan?
Yeah, I mean, sort of the Joan Didion 101 will tell you, she, and this is true, she rejects orthodox thought. She speaks of narrative, these ideas, the language that we all sort of swallow wholesale and accept. She made a career out of questioning that, close reading of all of that, and rejecting it and finding the cracks in all of that stuff. And you know, if you're someone who comes from the middle class or the lower middle class, especially, you have people in your life who are gripped by this idea that if they just work harder, or if they just can get a down payment on a house, or if they can just send their kid to the right school, they're going to somehow advance and take that next step up the ladder. And one day, 3 or 4 generations on, they're going to finally make it to the top of the mountain. And this is something that my family was going through in real time. I mean, I talk at length in the book about, you know, both of my parents were lower middle class folks, maybe, I think my mother probably middle class, my father certainly lower middle class. Neither of them went to college. All 3 of their children went to college and busted their asses to make sure that that happened. My father worked 2 jobs when I was in high school so that I could go to a parochial high school that I had asked to go to. But those gambles cost a lot. And one of the major threads in the book is my father eventually ending up involved in the real estate collapse of 2008, and more ultimately a conviction for wire fraud and being investigated for mortgage fraud. And these are things that he fell sideways into. He had been a blue collar worker. He worked for Port Authority, laying rail track and all of this stuff. So anyways, I had watched these gambles that he made, probably unconsciously, more or less, trying to get his family ahead. They worked. I was sitting on a bench with Joan Didion in Central Park, right? I mean, it's hard to say that didn't work, but I also started to notice how this country squeezes people who try to do better for their families, and really puts them in a position where, if you actually want to make that leap, the options available to you are quite limited, and oftentimes are not conventional, should I say. I mean, you end up on in the gray areas of society, trying to advance or get ahead, you know.
You talk about how everyone writes their own narrative, including your father,
Yeah,
who, throughout the time covered in the book at least, you know, really didn't think it was, you know, that anything wrong had been done, despite the conviction, despite the jail time.
that's right.
You know, so the fiction that we all create.
Yeah, that's right. And still, probably to this day, I think he would tell you that he didn't. And it's very funny. It's very funny to be the product of that, because it's hard for me to tell him that he's wrong, because maybe, you know, I mean, obviously legally, there, that the legal question has been settled.
Right.
The ethical question is much blurrier, and something that I think every family in America would be familiar with in one way or another.
Mhm.
Everyone who's trying to cut corners or get ahead, or get their kid an extra pair of sneakers for the fall, or, you know, whatever it is, we're all scrapping in our way. And it's something that I watched him do first, and to incredible with incredible success, and also with very serious consequences.
Right. one of the other threads running through your book, obviously you are called to be Joan's assistant because she's later in life. She needs somebody to take her to her doctor's appointments. She needs somebody to be in the house with her, to be her companion, to field phone calls and manage all of that stuff. But one of the themes ultimately is death and to a degree, suicidal ideation, which you struggled with. But I'd like to talk, and I think it's, you'll write at some point about how you finally talked to your now wife about, how long you had struggled with it and how you had kept it such a secret. So part of the beauty of this book, from my standpoint, was just your openness in that and the acknowledgement that, you say at some point in the time you've read these last few pages, somebody else has, suicided, which I think is in an age where people are trying not to share or to, things you can't be talking about that, I think is going to be make a powerful impact on a lot of your readers. But we did talk before about one section in your book that I wanted you to do an abbreviated reading of, because it talks about death and about how you can't know it until you know it, and how until you've actually experienced it through the death of a friend or a parent, or, so if you could just take a minute to read for those of you who do have the book. It is on page 73.
Sure, I would be happy to. So yeah, just for some context, this is that moment in the memoir where I'm starting to realize not only what Joan and others in her orbit found out, something that I'm discovering in real time, and some of my friends have also known. So in any case, those like Joan who know about death walk around with a secret knowledge that they keep from the rest of us. They know that a person comes and goes on this earth with the lasting effect of a whisper on a boulder, that people amount to very little in the end, that all that matters really are the sensory impressions accrue in life, memories that link together and resound, the loves, the regrets, the sounds of the wind in the wheat, the memories of the orange tulips, and beyond that, everything else is what goes.
Wow. For those of you who are watching, this is why I love this book. Language like that, which you will find on virtually every page. This is Uptown Local. I'm speaking with Cory Leadbeater, and the writing is phenomenal.
Thank you.
Some of the things that you, I think, did or come across as very natural, discussing your trip to the gardens where, this tree hasn't bloomed yet. It's in the midst of blooming. And then 10 pages later, you use, a reference to Joan blooming.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my gosh, look at that. And I was blown away. And so
thank you.
And I really say that with great, genuine sense of wow, jealousy, among other things. You talk in your book about writing fiction, and you have this character out of Oklahoma. I'm curious how you chose Oklahoma as a Jersey boy. Like, what? I know you visited, but how'd you get there? Of every place you could imagine. But
I know.
So you switched though. You had aspirations for fiction. You had a character, Billy Silvers. You have the character that you were speaking about, Ward, in another book. And then you made this switch from fiction to nonfiction to write this. What were the challenges in doing that? What were the parts that you found easier in terms of nonfiction? What was hard?
Yeah. I don't quite know what to say about that. I just sort of following the story. The Oklahoma preoccupation, just briefly, I took a trip with my older brother doing some research for a different book that I was working on at the time, and we visited Oklahoma City to visit the bombing memorial. And something about Oklahoma City is very urban, but driving through rural Oklahoma, there's something about that landscape that it didn't, I won't say it brought my mind peace, but it it was the landscape that my brain sort of naturally crafted itself onto. So in any case, there are a lot of reasons for that, and escaping and wanting a sort of free open space where my imagination could play and make characters up from scratch and all of this stuff. The switch to nonfiction, it just happened because I was so afraid of losing these memories that I had had with Joan. And I started writing down, and before I knew it, the craft part of my brain, the technical part of my brain, which I had honed in writing all of these novels for a decade, took over. And it was actually such a relief, because the organizing principles, the stuff that you were just talking about, where you allude to a particular image, and then 10 pages later you pick that image up and you sort of bring it home. That's stuff that I had been working on over and over and over again on the line level for a really long time. And so I was able to completely eliminate myself and just let these things pass through me, and trust that the instrument had been tuned enough that I was going to be able to stay out of the way and just let things pass through. So I don't think I would have been able to write this memoir the way that I did without all of that fiction training. And also, we haven't discussed it much. The book is very, it has through lines, but it's structured in a somewhat nonlinear way,
Yes.
which is how I organize my fiction. So there were commonalities that came through as the writing was unfolding. And those techniques are all things that I do in my fiction.
Interesting. I know, you talk about, having teachers when you were very young who were introducing you to books that to me sounded like a little bit ahead of yourself in terms of when did I read those and when do most kids read those. Can you talk about, certainly in light of what's happening across this country in terms of book banning and libraries being told you can't have this on your shelf, what impact all this literature had on you and art and exposure to things at a young age, or when in your formative years, and how that makes you think about what's happening now with what's happening in a lot of school districts.
Yeah, I mean, just to the story you're alluding to is, it's a very kind of, not cliche, but it happens to a lot of bookish, lonely children. I just had a wonderful librarian in my elementary school who took my hand and took me out of the little baby book section and brought me to the section with, I don't think we would call it young adult, maybe children's literature or something, Treasure Island and The Hobbit, that sort of stuff. But it was such a gift to me, and not the stories have not necessarily stuck with me. It was more, I was given this giant toolbox with which to understand myself, to articulate what was happening inside of me, what I was seeing, what I was feeling, the vast breadth of human experience. You really need a vocabulary to articulate what you're feeling and seeing and thinking. And that's what was given to me. And without that, I don't know if I ever would have had the same level of empathy for the experiences of others, the same level of kindness towards myself, as I was having really hard time with a lot of stuff. And so when I think about book bans, all I think about is you're from a place of fear, you are intentionally limiting the toolbox that you're giving these children. It is, I mean, I find it to be completely unjustifiable, and it scares the hell out of me, because I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of children out there right now who are so gifted and so ready and open to accept all of that stuff, and they're being denied that and this is not a choice that they're making. So
Right.
in any case.
Right. Well, there's so many literary qualities in this memoir. It's not a linear story. We learn about your upbringing. We learn about hanging out with your friends in the backyards, in the bars, uh, and just the experience of, ultimately, going at the time living in Jersey City and, taking the train and getting out and seeing fresh air and seeing the tulips on Park Avenue,
Yeah.
and the flowers, which, again, play a nice role as a symbol or motif in your book. Um, so I think there is just the beauty of that literature that shows through. Because I think in some senses, if you think back on your childhood, and there were many difficult moments there, and as there were for your parents in their childhoods, um, you couldn't have imagined at age 10 or 12 or even at age 23 that at 24 you would meet Joan Didion and your life would, having already taken this big leap into going to college and getting into an MFA program, to then have this amazing trajectory. Was that sort of, I mean, uh, one of the one of the praiseworthy blurbs talked about it being dizzying. Was that dizzying for you as just as an individual? Like, did you pinch yourself and say, "Oh my God, I go see Joan Didion every day"?
Yeah, yeah, it was completely dizzying. I think the literature that we were discussing before had prepared my lens to be open to everything I was seeing and feeling and observing, and um, but nothing could possibly prepare you for what what that experience is like. Um, it's one of the strangest qualities about New York. You know, you're a chef in the back of a restaurant, and then you do some private gigs, and then suddenly you're standing on a rooftop and whatever, and uh, by
King of the
the New
Hill.
York, yeah, by the New York elite, and it's just the strangest, incredible interplay where you're back and forth between the lower and the upper, the high and the low, and that is absolutely dizzying. It is so disorienting, um, but learned from Joan this kind of stillness where you have to be able to be present. If you can't, there's a moment in the memoir where I can't quite fix what was said at a particular dinner, and it makes me so angry that I missed something important. In order to, in order to have a full life, a really rich internal life, you have to work on being open and present in those moments. And even when it's so dizzy and that feels so impossible, particularly if you're a writer or an artist, you have to be aware of what you're receiving, what's coming in. And I think all the literature I read as a child and as a teenager and in undergrad, it all prepared me for that moment, even though nothing could have prepared me for that moment.
I mean, was there? I mean, obviously, she treated you like a son.
Yeah.
She inscribed a book beautifully to you, first edition book of hers. Um,
Yeah.
I'm sure you mourned her as a son might mourn a mother. Um, was there a sense of, I don't know, just my life now is, your life changed dramatically after she passed. It went from having, it changed when you signed on with her and lived with her and took care of her. And then it changed again after her passing. Um, what was that like emotionally? I mean, before you knew you were going to write, before you knew, I don't mean to.
No, it's okay. It was awful. It was awful, and I still really need her. I don't know what else to say about. There's no one else like her. You can't simulate a conversation with her. It was
No.
she. There was. I the memoir, talking to her, being in her presence was like what people go to church or synagogue or mosque for. It's you have to be. You're face to face with self truth. You really examine every single thought that you have. Is this really what I'm thinking? Have I gotten to the base of this? Or am I just existing on platitudes or
Right.
received idea? Have I interrogated this idea enough? Is this really what's troubling me? So to lose that is, existentially and psychically really scary. Um,
Mhm.
but more immediately, just having someone who loves you that much not be around anymore is really hard. I just thought she would be around to see my daughter for a few more years. I thought, yeah, I just thought we would have a little more time. And then the other thing that made it so strange was after she died, I kept going to that apartment for a really long time, and it was sealed while, there was a lot left there that had to be dealt with. And it's ironic. She writes about this in Your Magical Thinking about, keeping John's shoes around in case he came
Mhm.
back. But going to that apartment every day for almost a year after she died, which I talk about in the book, that was maybe the biggest obstacle to mourning her, because
Very
it
hard.
was, yeah, it was not until I stopped going to that apartment every day that I really had to realize that my life there with her had definitively concluded. And yet the book suggests that it probably will never conclude. I'm going to always be thinking about her and talking about her and missing her. And that's just the nature of grief, I guess. If you're
But you
fortunate
also
enough to
had
have a close relationship, this is sort of the inevitable conclusion of them.
right. I mean, it was such a gift to you. I mean, you, as much as you supported her and she needed you and relied on you and for your assistance and support and conversation and intellectual stimulation, et cetera, what a gift she gave you to both be in your life in a very intimate way, as you said, but also to sort of focus you on, what is your truth, what is your purpose, what do you really, really think about something, but also to put you in that milieu of a world that most of us never see, and that you had like an aisle seat to the
That's right.
show.
That's right.
Um,
I mean, that's I gotta say, one of the weirdest parts is um, realizing how I don't think I ever took it for granted, but realizing, yeah, whatever, I have no idea what's going to come in my career. I hope one day to earn my spot there on my own. But
sure.
it's also just as likely that I will never have access to that world ever again. So that's entirely strange to process as well.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, beyond all of that, the memoir is an ode to the person who kept me alive during this really difficult decade, which probably sounds so strange to people. You were working for Joan Didion, you lived on the Upper East Side. Like, how could it have been such a hard decade? But the memoir is a catalog of all of this. It was like one good thing would happen and one horrific thing would happen
Yeah.
every single time. And she was the reason that I made it through all of that. And there was a lot of debate right before we wrapped the book about I think I actually say in the book, someone mentioned something about, now that she's gone, you have to sort of engage with Didion on the page or something like that. And the Joan in this book is not Joan Didion, the writer. This is this person, Joan, who welcomed me into her home and her life for a decade and gave me a gift that every little struggling 24-year-old artist deserves, and that very few of us actually get. And so it's just, I just want to make it clear how grateful I am, and how I am completely aware that it was totally random and accidental, and yeah, no one gets that lucky.
It was magical, to use the word that she often chose.
Yeah.
Um, so I just want to close this out. We've been talking about Uptown Local, which is a beautiful book. You will learn a lot about Joan Didion and see her in a very intimate way, as a not just as this brilliant New York literary icon, an author of so many great works and essays, but as a maternal person who loves the arts and conversation and caring for her caretakers. It's a beautiful book. It's about that, and it's about a lot more. Cory alluded to how she really got him through a tough decade. There's a lot of that. It's a very human and engaging story on many fronts, and I cannot recommend it enough. So if you haven't bought it yet, go out, buy Uptown Local. If you're a New Yorker, it will be illuminating in many ways. If you're interested in the literary world, and it's just a great human interest story. And I'm honored that you were able to join us on the show.
Thank you for having me, Ellen. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you. And just in closing, I just want to remind people that the Blaze is here many days a week. You can find out all about our programming at mightyblaze.com and sign up for your newsletter. I'll be back June 28th with our Friday frontliner, who is Joyce Maynard, which I'm super excited about, as I am all of our shows. And then on July 25th, I have a debut spotlight doubleheader with Amy Neff, author of The Days I Loved You Most, at 1 p.m., followed by Jessica Waite, who has the memoir with perhaps the best ever title, The Widow's Guide to Dead Bastards. Laugh now and read it, and you'll laugh again. It's a great book. So thank you, Cory, and we'll see you all next time. Keep reading.